and welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving.
I can vouch for that.
In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection.
Yes,
This week, Greg Koukl from Stand to Reason joins us to brainstorm about challenging the narrative in a post-Christian world. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is Retouched by an Angel, a new adventure every week. Check local listings for details. Our regular legal disclaimer: our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Greg Koukl, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements notice: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now we greet our guest, Mr. Greg Koukl.
Hello, gentlemen. You show your age by mentioning Y2K. You're definitely not a millennial. You're an old guy like me.
Yes, we used to have fake applause where I would hold up my fingers and go like that. But for guests like you, we sprung for the real fake applause.
The real McCoy, huh?
Yes.
All right, good. Yes. Thanks. Thank you, boys. Good to see you.
We are so glad that you agreed. You consented to join our little happy club here.
Despite your better judgment.
Despite, yeah. But I should have had you check with Melissa Doutry, my friend Melissa Doutry, before you came, so she could forewarn you that what kind of stuff.
Yeah, you guys are a little goofy, I can tell already. So,
well,
that's what we're going for.
For me, it helps me when I'm talking to people about the gospel, because I can sort of disarm them a little bit in advance. And oftentimes I have a cowboy hat, fringe jacket, and embroidered shirts, and that
disarms me as soon as I see you, Don.
Kind of does, and that's it. Where did you get that jacket? So now we have this discussion going to enable me to ask some other questions. So I've kind of been intrigued by reading your material, because I go, we really do pretty much the same kind of thing. We figure out how to ask the next right question. And I just wanted to point out we have 2 of your books here.
Yes.
That we wanted to mention for people to get, and we have the link in the description below, so you can order them. Where's my finger? There's my finger. Tactics and Street Smarts.
By the way, it cropped your image, Don. So put your finger closer to your face and point down. That's
well.
We couldn't see you. It was off to the.
I have a whole different idea. I'm going to do this.
Okay, yeah.
It's down there.
It's still there. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I noticed something, by the way, in the image that your tactics book is missing this red oval here, and that's the indicator that it's the 10th anniversary edition. That came out 4 years ago with 35% more materials. So,
my
Don, you guys are in the earlier version. You got to get up to date.
I've got that version on Kindle. It says 10th anniversary.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, right. I love having authors.
I'm not sure what, because I nabbed this off of Amazon. So.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, you must have nabbed it about 5 years.
But we've got you beat, because we're coming out with the 20th anniversary of our Gothard book. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you got me beat there.
Not that it's a competition, but.
No, but okay. Well, I got to come back at you now. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had our 30th anniversary for Stand to Reason, the organization that I represent and work
That's something to
for.
celebrate. That is something
Yeah,
to celebrate.
well, I'm telling you, we're really thrilled. It's hard to believe it's been 30 years, and the things that God has done through Stand to Reason, we're just a bit awed by it. It's been like having a tiger by the tail for 30 years. So anyway, so can you beat 30? Oh, you've been married 50.
Well,
Don, so,
Don,
right.
you started Midwest Christian Outreach in 92?
1995.
95,
April
okay.
1, April Fool's Day, 1995.
Oh, that's right. Okay. I was out of my group for a while. Okay. Yeah,
Right.
the 90s are kind of foggy for me.
Since 88.
But with another
We
group.
officially incorporated in 95. So,
Yeah.
been an adventure. It wasn't planned. I was going to be a rich general contractor and support missionaries. I never planned on being one, but God had a odd sense of humor.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
He does that.
Yeah. So,
right.
So, and I appreciate your work in these books, especially. There's a couple of things I just wanted to mention that you brought out, which I really liked, and that is there's no silver bullets, and I'll come back to that in a second. This is something I call the silver bullet syndrome, that there's somehow a magical verse or something that you can shoot at somebody and they will just become a believers. The second I came across was that you said you haven't prayed with anyone to receive the Lord in 30 years.
That's right. That's like that qualifies me as an evangelism loser, And
walk around like this.
I am trying to get people's attention a little bit to make a point. This is true, so I'm not doing it for showmanship, but it's to make a point about how I think New Testament evangelism actually worked then and how evangelism works now. And that is that right now, the methods that we have, that we practice, that most people are familiar with are actually harvest methods that are relatively new historically, maybe 150 years older. Altar calls, challenging people to pray to receive Christ as Lord and Savior, that kind of thing. The kind of thing that you see in the back of tracts or that churches regularly practice on Sunday morning. Now, I'm not against any of those things, and I've used them and God has used them, there's no question. But, a lot of Christians are not comfortable doing that, especially when you're in a kind of a culture now that is more hostile than it's ever been. And you guys, I'm looking at your pictures. You're like me. We're all old guys. So we've been around for a while. We've seen the culture change radically from the Jesus movement days in the 70s to now 50 years later. And the hostility that we see in a post, not just a post-Christian culture, but an anti-Christian culture ideologically, and sometimes that ideological anti turns into personal anti, and we have to face the heat because we are faithful to Christ. So things have changed radically for us in terms of the cultural conversation, but what hasn't changed is the style of evangelism that we've kind of inherited from our forebears, so to speak. And my observation has been that a couple of them, one of them is that there's a whole lot of Christians, if they were expected to do evangelism that way, kind of give the simple gospel and try to get people to pray to receive Christ, they're just not going to do it. They're going to sit on the bench because they're frightened and they don't know if they can handle the objections. And I think they have a wrong view of evangelism. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And they don't have a plan. And so they're in the deep end of the pool paddling around, hopefully, and that's discomforting for them. So they're not going to get wet at all. They're not going to get, in the language of the newest book, Street Smarts, they're not going to get into the street. The street is where you feel uncomfortable, where you feel like you might be threatened and you may not be up to the threat. Okay. I live in Los Angeles, right? So you don't go to South Central, right? You don't walk there. You don't drive there. You don't fly over there. It's like, why? Because it's dangerous. Unless you're an MMA fighter or you're packing heat or something like that, you're armed. Well, then you are equipped for the circumstance. But most people aren't, so they stay out. Same thing with evangelism. And so there's on the one hand, you've got this methodology that we have received that's actually not that old, 150 years old. And the New Testament, we see a different kind of pattern. And what I like to do to make the distinction here, and this is all kind of leading up to this bizarre statement that's in the book that I haven't prayed with anyone to receive Christ for 30 years. There's a rationale here. And I'm going to redeem myself in a moment, and hopefully people will see the point. I like going to John chapter 4 and looking at the conversation that Jesus had with the disciples after he talked with the woman at the well. She's gone off to Sychar. He tells the disciples who have not been party to that conversation, he said, you say there are 4 months and then come the harvest. I say, look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. Now, I don't think Jesus was referring to every field. I think he was talking about Sychar. And his sense was, in his conversation with this woman, and now she's gone off to talk to the people, and now they're coming to see him, was that there's something big that's going to happen here. But he tells the disciples that you are about to reap where you did not sow.
Right.
Okay. Somebody else did the heavy lifting. You're going to get the low-hanging fruit. And this concept of low-hanging fruit is important. It's just a metaphor, obviously, but it's meant to make the point that when the fruit is ripe, it's easy to harvest. Ripe fruit is easy to harvest. However, you can't have a harvest unless you've had a season of, I'm just going to call it gardening. Okay. Jesus talked about sowing and reaping, and I'm talking about gardening and harvesting. It's the same idea, the same principle. And so you have a season of sowing and a season of reaping, a season of gardening and a season of harvesting. And some do the gardening and some do the harvesting. The disciples were going to get to harvest the easy stuff then. And that's what that conversation was about. But I think what it also tells us is not just that there's 2 seasons in maybe a community's life, or really more appropriately in a individual's life, because we're talking individuals. And there are 2 kinds of workers. So there is the gardening season and the harvesting season for an individual. In about a week, let's look at the calendar here. Today's the 20th. Okay, 1 week from today. No, 1 week from tomorrow is my spiritual birthday. September 28th, 1973, I became a Christian. But that wasn't the first time I heard the gospel. My brother Mark had been gardening, doing what he could in my life for years. And it was the last 6 months of that process that I really started listening, asking questions, pushing back, but thinking about what was said until finally Mark came to my apartment that night and he started telling me more about Jesus. I said, you don't need to do that. I've already decided I want to become a Christian. Okay, notice what happened. He did not harvest me. I harvested myself, so to speak. But of course, we both know it was the Holy Spirit.
Holy Spirit, right.
That was doing the work. And when I look at the New Testament, I don't see any altar calls. I don't see any people being invited to receive Christ as Lord and Savior. Now, that particular motif, again, which I'm not putting down, but wasn't the pattern in the New Testament. What happened? You see gardening. Paul explicitly says in 1 Corinthians, I planted, Apollos watered, God caused the increase. Okay. And so with that in mind, since this book, Street Smarts, has come out, this is the recent book, just came out 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago. I've been giving a number of talks pertaining to this, and I've decided to start taking a poll. And I didn't know what I was going to get, but I was curious how people would respond, what the numbers would look like. And so I've talked to audiences from a couple hundred to, maybe 800 or 900, close to 1,000, taking this poll. And here's the question that I've asked. I said, how many people here who are Christians now did not become Christian by praying the sinner's prayer with somebody else who led them to Christ, or did not become a Christian by coming forward with an altar call? That's like the standard motif that we think about now. The first couple of audiences, 1/3 of the people raised their hand. I mean, that was stunning to me. 1/3. The next few audiences, over 75% raised their hand. In other words, in roughly average it out, 50 to 60% of the people that I was talking to were not led to Christ in that way.
Right.
They got harvested in all kinds of different ways, but by the Holy Spirit. Okay. And people who are listening to the show, watching the show now, could just ask themselves, what happened in my life? How did this work out? And I suspect for the majority of the people listening, number one, they didn't become a Christian immediately after they heard the good news and understood it.
Right.
Secondly, no one was there leading them to Christ, but rather when the harvest was ready in their life, when the fruit was ripe, it just fell into the basket. And so my approach with the tactics book, which was first, and the Street Smarts, which is an extension to the tactics book, my approach trades on this notion that we're going to focus on gardening because that's where the heavy lifting is being done. And we have a big team of people. And if we each do a little bit of gardening here and a little there, whatever, and don't worry about hitting home runs, and pardon me for the mixed metaphors, then we're going to really make a much bigger difference in the long run. And just very quickly, let me go back to that comment. And that comment was, I haven't prayed with somebody to receive Christ in 30 years. So I don't know the breadth of your reading in apologetics. Pretty good, pretty big, obviously. But you do a lot of work with cults, which isn't my expertise. But maybe you've heard of a guy named J. Warner Wallace. Okay, so Jim Wallace was a guy who is a cold case detective in the Torrance PD in LA County for many, many years. And he was famous because he was really good at solving murders that had been cold for 10, 20, or 30 years. They couldn't find whoever killed him. He was good at getting it. He knew how evidence worked and eyewitness testimony and all that. But J. Warner Wallace was an atheist. And then someone challenged him about Christ, said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And he said, well, I'm going to find out about that. He bought a Bible for about $4 and he started applying his expertise as a detective. Now, this is a guy who's been on TV with 4 different cases that he solved that made it to Nightline, right? Or Dateline or whatever that is, you know.
Wow.
So they called him the evidence whisperer, you know. So anyway, when he applied his tools of detective work to the cold case of the death of Jesus of Nazareth 2,000 years ago and alleged resurrection, he came to the conclusion that the testimonies could be trusted, that Jesus rose from the dead, and then he became a Christian, and then a Christian apologist and a writer and a best-selling author writing the book, the first of 5 now, titled Cold Case Christianity, which I highly recommend. It just was re-released 2 weeks ago in the 10th anniversary edition. Fabulous. Okay. Here's what people who know about J. Warner Wallace don't know about him. They don't know that he was in my garden when he was an atheist.
Right.
He was listening to my radio show, listening to the things I was saying about God and Christianity and the Bible and all those things when he was still an atheist. Or you might know Abdu Murray. Abdu Murray is a Muslim attorney from Detroit who became a Christian, then became a Christian apologist. Then he's written a number of books. Well, Abdu Murray, when he was a Muslim, was in my garden. We have he was listening to our show. I've got a guy on my team, John Noyes. And John Noyes was an atheist in my garden, became a Christian, has no idea when a spiritual birthday is. He just got harvested by the Spirit sometime. Now he's a believer and he's an apologist, a public speaker on our team. Okay. And he was in my garden. Now I'm not saying this to wave my own flag. Look at J. Warner Wallace, Abdu Murray, John Noy. I'm just saying this to say this is how it works.
Right.
See how you can be effective just by gardening. You have an impact on other people's lives.
By the way, I was saying to Don, I usually skip over the forewords of books. But for some reason, my eyes landed on the first words of the foreword of Street Smarts, and it says conversations with murderers are always challenging. And I said, okay, this hooked me in. Okay, I'm going to read this whole foreword now. That's J. Warner Wallace. He wrote the foreword, and I thought, that's a good way to start a book.
Yeah, it is. It is. I always read the first lines of books because I'm interested to see how authors got into it. And my first line is, I'm going to say something amazing. Evangelism is hard for me.
Right. That's
which is also an eye-opener.
Ron sent that to me, and I cracked it up and I started reading it. And I said, okay, Now, this is interesting to me for this reason. I very often get phone calls from individuals or emails saying, I have a Jehovah's Witness coming, a Mormon coming, I'm talking to an atheist or a Hindu. Where do I start? And I tell them the same thing. Get a cup of coffee, get a pastry, and ask them, why are you what you are?
Yeah.
And then listen to what they say, because they're going to tell you some very important things along the way, which will give you the opportunity to ask other questions.
Right.
And it unveils itself. God is very good at doing that, but you have to listen and you have to be patient and just ask questions, which is what you're doing in tactics. That's what he did here. He set up a meal. That's what he goes on to talk about in the foreword. And it built a sort of relationship with the individual that is in an adversarial situation.
Yeah, the guy he talks about is a accused murderer, and he ends up not just being accused but being convicted, as it turns out. But you're right, this is an adversarial relationship. But how does J. Warner Wallace maneuver? And he gives some outline of the tactical approach. He said, this is the way Greg does it, and
right.
And Greg's my mentor, and this book will mentor you to that. So here's this great apologist, J. Warner Wallace, and I don't know if you've ever seen him in action, but there's nobody like Jim. He's the best. He's the most compelling. He's the most interesting. He's funny. He is powerful. But he is in some ways the fruit of the gardening that I did. And if we can teach more people to garden, there are going to be more J. Warner Wallaces around.
You were talking earlier about how old we are, and I really want you to know how much I resent you for that. But at the same time, it reminded me of, it seemed like every 10, 11, 12 years, a new book came out, a new big book came out on evangelism, How to Give Away Your Faith, 1962, Evangelism Explosion, 1972, roughly, how a lifestyle evangelism, 1983. And it seems like with each book, I mean, obviously How to Give Away Your Faith is kind of really very much in the genre that you're writing in. You're trying to encourage people to witness. But I look back to see how far does this genre extend. And I found, of course, Charles Spurgeon's 1876, The Soul Winner. I'd like to crack that open sometime to find out, because when I look in each of these, I don't remember so much of an emphasis on the distinction you make, which I think is extremely encouraging, between the gardening season and the harvesting. I mean, it jumps out at us in 1 Corinthians. One plants, another waters, God gives the increase. None of us can take credit for when somebody comes to know the Lord, So what is so encouraging about that to me is the idea that it's okay. It's okay to have an inconclusive conversation with somebody.
Well, it is, and you may not see them come to the faith. You may, as you did with J. Warner Wallace. I want to tell a story that's going to get to 2 points regarding exactly what you're talking about. I mentioned before we came on that we got involved with this because my wife met some Jehovah's Witnesses, and she wanted to reach them. By and by, she opened a pre-recorded helpline, and she would change the number each week and new recording and so forth. Eventually, that became a live helpline that JWs could call. And so she had joined this bowling league, met these Jehovah's Witnesses, fell in love with them, was praying for them, trying to learn everything about them. And some years down the road, we got a phone call from a woman who was about to commit suicide, calling the pre-recorded help, calling the live line now. And as they're talking, she asked, why do you do this? And so Joy told the story about what they're doing. And she wouldn't give her a name. She was afraid, because JWs think the Watchtower is trying to catch them. And so the woman, as Joy said, well, I met some Jehovah's Witnesses on a bowling league and so forth. And the woman goes, I know who you are. And she goes, really? Who are you? She goes, why do you want to know? And she goes, okay, don't tell me. And so they talked some more, and she gave her the gospel, explained the Watchtower. And then that was back in the days when we had cassette tapes. And we
we are old.
JWs. from JW conventions, all former JWs. And so Joyce said, okay, now I'm going to need a name. It doesn't have to be your name. And I'm going to need an address. It doesn't have to be your address, but someplace where you can get what I'm going to send you. And so she said, well, my name is, and she gave it to her. And Joy was floored because this was the woman who persuaded the JWs to join the bowling league 20 some years earlier.
Wow.
And so we sent the tapes to her. She's listening to them, gives them to her husband, who's been a JW now for 35 years at this point. And he's a truck driver. So he leaves on Monday. He goes, okay, well, they might be right about the Watchtower, but they'll never convince me Jesus is God. And he leaves. He comes back Friday afternoon, walks in the door and goes, Jesus is God. They have too many Bible verses that prove it. They became believers. Now, so we started meeting with them to disciple them. At which point we discover his elderly aunt, a Baptist in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had been praying for him every day for 35 years. And we discovered two things. One, there's likely someone praying for whoever we lead to the Lord when that does happen, that has been praying for them for a while. Two, because we've been doing what you call the gardening, which is exactly right, for the previous 20 years, God used all of that work to lead them to the Lord. And we just were along for the ride.
Yeah. Wow. It's a cumulative process in people's lives. It's hardly ever the case that someone hears the gospel for the first time with clarity and says, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. It does happen sometimes, but people are, especially with the cultural narrative that you guys address, people have very deep emotional commitments to a way of looking at reality that is deeply narcissistic. I mean, probably the phrase that captures the ethic of the age, the spirit of the age, what did they say? The zeitgeist, right? I'm looking for my German word there somewhere to impress people. It's the phrase is you do you.
You do
right?
you. Yeah.
You do you. That's it. Two personal pronouns and a verb. That's it. I mean, it's like that's the whole thing. It is so profoundly narcissistic. Okay. And when people who are profoundly narcissistic do not want to let go of their narcissism easily. And this is why I think more than ever we need what Francis Schaeffer used to call pre-evangelism.
Right.
You have to do the work to remove the obstacles that keep people from even considering the so-called simple gospel if they understood it when they heard it. These are all liabilities.
And you don't always know what the obstacles are unless you ask them. And
That's
so one of the terms I use when I get these phone calls is you have to discern what they are invested in. And they go, what do you mean? I go, everybody who is in whatever worldview it is, they've made an investment, no different than buying gold or investing in a stock. And they don't want to believe they've made a bad investment. So they're going to hold on to that. And your task really is to ask the questions that will help them to analyze this investment without fear of some sort of reprisal that you're going to make fun of them or whatever. They have to be safe to do that.
That's right.
And the thing is, we've had this modeled for us, this gardening season type evangelism really for almost 2,000 years in a book by Justin Martyr called Dialogue with Trypho, where he's witnessing to an unbelieving Jew. It's a dialogue with a Jew, that's what it's called.
Trypho, right.
Yeah, and he it's not conclusive at the end. The really amazing thing about it is that it's a very amicable, very ironic dialogue discussion. And they part as friends, but it doesn't. There is no altar call. There is no, there is no closing the deal, so to speak.
There's no press for a decision.
Right.
Yeah. Now, I've not read that piece. I'm familiar with it, but
it's fascinating read. Yeah, Ron's right. Yeah.
But it's nice to know, and it just reaffirms the point that I've been making, that the gardening concept goes way back, and we see it there in the New Testament. You mentioned the Corinthians passage explicitly, and also the first John chapter 4 explicitly discussed. But then the practice of it is done all the time. I've pointed out, for example, in the Gospels here, Jesus presents the gospel. Okay, I'm putting quotes around it because I know when I say the gospel, people are thinking something very particular, some particular kind of wording. But he presents the breadth of the message in different pieces and different ways at different times. Okay, the gospel is the good news. Good news is not good news without the bad news. You got to understand what the gospel, the problem it's solving. And if you don't know the problem it's solving, it doesn't sound like good news. Okay, so how does Jesus start out Sermon on the Mount? Well, nice things of blessed this, blessed that. That's great, memorable, encouraging for people that are having hard times. But then he shifts and he says, now, your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. All right, got it? And we're not going to remove the law. That's not going out either, you know. So, and by the way, the law says don't commit murder. Oh, I haven't done that. Right. Well, did you call your brother an idiot? Of course. You're going to hell.
Yep.
That's
done.
Jesus. Don't commit adultery. I didn't do that. Did you ever think about it? Yeah. You're going to hell. Okay. This is a lot of bad news. And what's interesting, he never gets, in the Sermon on the Mount, he never gets to the good news of Jesus dying for your sin and releasing you from the debt burden that he's making you feel there in the first part of the chapter. All right. He's got a lot of things there about good moral living, but notice that none of the things that happen are things that we can actually do consistently.
Right.
And so we are condemned by what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's not until later that Jesus says something like, come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And I think, gentlemen, the main application that Jesus had in view there wasn't that Christians come to him and get comfort. Certainly that's involved. He was talking about those who are laboring under the burden of the law,
Right.
overwhelmed by its demand. I will give you rest. My burden is light. Okay. And so notice you don't have the gospel communicated in a couple of sentences. You have gardening going on, the kind of gardening that's appropriate to the audience at that point in time. And the harvest comes later. By the way, the harvest on Pentecost Sunday, 3,000 people? There was another occasion soon after, thousands more. That wasn't the first time those people heard this message. Jesus had been preaching everywhere for the last 3.5 years. And for 40 days, the disciples were out proclaiming it. But when Peter nailed them by saying, you know, God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified, they were cut to the quick. And there was that harvest. It happened.
Now that we talk about that, we're going to turn the corner for a moment to get to another topic.
Okay.
And I want to start out with the Parliament of World Religions just briefly. Because
the what? Say it again.
There was about 7,000 or 8,000 from around the world at the Parliament of World Religions. It is an event that everyone like you should be at. Because you have Hindus and Buddhists and Wiccans and Satanists and everybody all gathered in one place looking for world peace. And their one theme that's prevalent with everyone you talk to is they know truth by their inner knowingness. They have a narrative that's their inner knowingness that is not objectively true, but they know it's true internally. And some get this by spirit guidance of various kinds. One of our sponsors actually has a product to kind of deal with that.
Well, yeah, Cynthia's life is in crisis. She doesn't know if she can believe she's a sinner. How will she break the news to her parole officer? Jacob is still in shock. His pastor laughed when he suggested he might be a reincarnation of Elvis. Will he ever find a church that supports his spiritual views? Charity is engaged to Brad, who is already married to Betsy. That won't be a problem in Brad's and Betsy's polygamous cult, but Charity wonders how all this will work out in the afterlife. All these people have one thing in common. They're looking for a gospel that's been retouched by an angel. If your gospel bothers you, have it retouched with a new adventure every week. Consult local listings for details. Retouched by an angel. So we have people. This is somehow going to segue into what you were talking about with the Parliament of World's Religions, right, Don?
It absolutely is, because, and Ron and I, we've talked about this a lot. In fact, we created a little seal to represent this. Virtually every religion we talk to at the Parliament or even at Paganicon has a Jesus in their belief system. Mm-hmm. It just happens to be a redefined Jesus that fits
what Paul calls in 2 Corinthians 11 another Jesus.
Another Jesus, right? So they believe very satisfied. Their Jesus is good to them, beats all their needs, executive, and doesn't call them sinners, and it fits the narrative that they are providing. Now, that is not just the Parliament of World Religions. This is, I would suggest, emblematic of what we see going on in culture today.
In the church, too, in many cases.
Unfortunately, in the church. Now, that's almost a whole separate discussion, because, as you point out, that the type of evangelism that has been practiced for 150 years, and, their hearts are in the right place, but I argue that since Finney in 1825 sort of transformed the church and moved education out and brought evangelism in, with that then was the loss of actual discipleship and education. And we're now suffering for that as a result of that. Mm-hmm. So we have churches that their whole existence is predicated on trying to find a way to get non-believers in to kind of sneak up on them with the gospel, but no one's being discipled or trained. Mm-hmm. So even to share the gospel, how many understand even what it is other than they came to the faith?
Yeah,
so that's another discussion.
Yeah, that's this whole, when Jesus is very popular, and actually one of the tactics that I have in the tactics book is called "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," and the move there is, since Jesus is very popular, then when we are challenged on our convictions that really are just a reflection of following Jesus and his teaching, we can put it on him. So people might say, oh, well, you guys are so arrogant. You're so narrow-minded. You're so bigoted. Well, my first question is to ask for clarification. What do you mean by that? Is my first question. I'm just gathering some information. Well, you guys think you're right and everybody else is wrong. Okay. That's intolerant. All right. That's bigoted. Okay. And so now I have a clear idea of why this person is calling me names, which is all it really amounts to. Those who've been homeschooled recognize this as an ad hominem, a fallacy. Nevertheless, this is what we're faced with. So how do I maneuver here in a street smarts kind of way? First, I get clarification on the view, and then I know there's a flaw there, or actually a number of them, but I'm going to expose one of them by using questions to get there. And the question is going to be, why do you think Christians believe that Jesus is the only way of salvation? Well, they might say, well, because you're a bunch of bigots. That's why. All right, because that's a bigoted claim. All right, great. Yeah. Where do you think they got that? I don't know. The reason Christians believe that is because that's what Jesus said himself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. So, do you think Jesus was a bigot? Okay, now that's a question, right? I could have said, well, that's Jesus' idea. Jesus is no bigot. And now I'm making declarations. And whenever you make a declaration against somebody else's view, you're inviting them to disagree with you. And now you got a fight on your hands. But instead, I say, because I know, just as you demonstrated there at the World Religions Convention, everybody wants Jesus on their team. They think he's great. Okay, so now I'm going to leverage that. What a friend we have in Jesus. I'm using him on my side, given that he is popular with them. Do you think Jesus was a bigot? No, of course not. He loved everybody. Well, Jesus said this. And by the way, he didn't just say something like that in John 14:6. In John 3, the wonderful "For God so loved the world" passage, he says the people they didn't want the light because their deeds were evil. Right. And then he further says, he who believes has life. He who does not believe, the wrath of God abides on him. That's Jesus, John 3:36. And there's a bunch more too. So when one of the difficulties, this, with people, all those other religions who think Jesus is great, those folks have really probably never read Jesus,
Right. Yeah. They'd probably be pretty offended.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I had something that I did some years ago that I have been able to use because I discovered somewhere along the line that one of the best ways to talk to somebody is to talk about somebody else. Because that's not threatening. I'm not picking on them. I'm not picking on their belief system.
Okay.
I'm not, right? I'm talking about that group over there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had opportunity. I took a group on a tour through a Hindu temple. This is way too fun. And the individual is conducting a tour, stopping at each of the different places and describing this is an incarnation of Vishnu, and he would explain what's going on. Then we'd go to the next one, and this is an incarnation of Vishnu. And somebody near the end asked, "Is Jesus an incarnation of Vishnu?" And he said, "Yes." And so I have a question. Would one incarnation of Vishnu lie about all of the other incarnations of Vishnu?
That's great.
And he said, "No." And I said, "Okay, then help me understand this, because Jesus said that he is the only way, the only truth, and the only life. No one comes to the Father except through him. Is that true?" And he stood and he stared for a moment and he said, "Jesus lied," and he turned and walked away.
Wow.
And others that had kind of attached to our group as we went in, who were considering becoming Hindus, decided this is a problem, as we had some very interesting conversations.
Well, if Jesus lied, how could he be an incarnation of Vishnu?
Right.
Vishnu's a noble character, right?
So here's how this works itself out then at the Parliament, because now I have that experience and I can draw on it. On at least 5 occasions in talking with someone, I would tell them that story and then say, "How would you respond to that?" And almost everyone, without the Sikh said the same. The Sikh that I spoke with said, "Well, that's a mistranslation." So then that gave us a different kind of a conversation to ask.
Right. Yeah.
But almost to a person, they said, "Well, that isn't really what he meant." And so we can now talk about, well, what does he mean? What do you believe about Jesus?
Excellent. Yeah. Well, you with the question, you get a response that gives you more information that you could ask more questions about usually. And by the way, there's another place where Jesus actually made it worse. He said in John 10, "All who came before me are thieves and robbers.
Oh boy.
I am the good shepherd who has laid down his life for his sheep." Okay. So, whoa. And so the thing is, I actually saw an article once that was written by somebody, it published in the Huffington Press. Okay, very leftist thing. And he was arguing about John 14, where Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." He said, that's not what he means. You Christians, you got it all wrong. So he's spinning John 14:6 in his own way. Well, if that was the only verse that we had, well, okay, maybe it's a jump ball. Maybe there's other ways to take it. But we have dozens and dozens and dozens of verses. In fact, I got a little red booklet here we put together at Stand to Reason. It says, "Jesus the only way," 100 verses, 9 lines of argument in the New Testament. Why Jesus is the only way of salvation. This is something that was repeated over and over and over again. And in fact, if he wasn't the only way of salvation, nothing about Jesus' ministry makes any sense whatsoever, because he doesn't come to teach morality. I mean, there were a lot of things that he said that you can find already by the Hebrew prophets. They said it already. He didn't come just to repeat what they've already said. He came to do something entirely different, what the prophets anticipated. Okay. And that's why they spoke of him. And so this is why I mentioned earlier, if people who make this kind of claim, they haven't read Jesus. Now, there's another angle in this with the world religions and people using Jesus, because a lot of these people, like the one you just mentioned, are going to be dismissive of the Bible in general as being an authoritative source of information. Okay, well, that's mistranslated. You're misunderstanding. That was only written by men. That's been changed over and over and over. I actually did a 1-hour national TV debate with Deepak Chopra. And Deepak Chopra
Really?
said, he's the #1 New Age guru in the world. At that time, and that was about 15 years ago, he'd already sold 20 million books. All right. And he started out by saying at one point that he keeps a copy of the Sermon on the Mount in his pocket because it's wherever he goes. I should have asked him to produce it, but I didn't want to, call him a liar, on national TV. I wanted to be winsome and attractive. So I just took him at his word. And because it was the greatest moral teaching, blah, blah, blah. And then a little while later, he's chastising Christians' belief in the Bible because the Bible's been changed so many times. And this is the 16th iteration of the scriptures, which didn't make any sense to me at all. We had a bit of a discussion about that. And so, wait, what is it going to be? Either Jesus said the Sermon on the Mount or he didn't. If he said it and you think he did, then you've got a big chunk of the Gospel of Matthew that's reliable. Right. And that means that maybe there's a whole bunch more that's been reliable. If you can't count on any of it, as he was dismissive of it later, then you can't count on that Sermon on the Mount. You can't have it both ways. But it was now I didn't pick up on that issue when we had our conversation. I could have pointed that out. But how these things go. Sometimes you miss real important things because you're focusing on other things. But it does go to the point. And this is the way tactically I would approach this. Using questions the way I teach in the tactics book and especially the street smarts book is I'm going to press them on their knowledge of Jesus. Well, what's your view about Jesus? Oh, this, that, and the other thing, right? Okay. And all these different religions that are trying to co-opt Jesus for their religion. Okay, great. So you think all those things are true about? Yes. Where are you getting your information about Jesus? That's my next question. Now, there are, 17, 18, 19 different secular sources that make reference to Jesus, okay? Josephus has some, and Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, et cetera, the Talmud. But they give you little bits and pieces that correlate to the main sources of information about Jesus we know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the primary source documents on the life of Jesus. But if you're going to diss the primary source documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you don't have enough information to even have an opinion about Jesus to begin with. And so this is what I'm going to press them on with my question. Well, if you can't trust those documents, how do you know that Jesus was an ascended master or had the Christ spirit in him or was a guru of some sort or was a whatever? How can you say that? Or was a great moral teacher, whatever other Jesus people offer, they think it's the Jesus of history. But the Jesus of history is attested in depth only in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the documents that historians use to assess the details of the historical Jesus. And they assess them as reliable historical sources. Now, they don't believe in in all of the supernatural stuff, but the rest of the stuff they're fine with, because they think it's reliable. So if you're dissing this and you can't rely on the New Testament documents like that, where are you getting your information about Jesus that you could advance him as some kind of member of your religious sect? That's the key question here.
Yeah.
That is, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because even Bart Ehrman, who is he's not a believer.
I guess not. That's an understatement.
Well, it's that's a whole different discussion probably, but it's interesting that even though he wouldn't identify himself as a Christian, he is almost one of the better defenders for the reliability of the text, not the inspiration, but the reliability of the text,
right,
than many evangelicals who would subscribe to inerrancy.
And the historicity of Jesus too.
Yes, that's right. He wrote a whole book on the historicity of Jesus. I cite this in Street Smarts because I have the video clip where he is chastising an atheist who's a myther.
Probably Robert Price, right?
Yeah, well, the guy says there's no historical information. I don't see any historical information for Jesus, and Bart Ehrman, who is no friend of Christianity, he's a powerful critic of Christianity. He hates Christianity. He says, well, I do. I wrote a whole book on it, and the reason that we believe he's historical is that we have primary source documents that go back very early. We have multiple sources, and they agree with each other. I mean, that's what you need to get good history. And then he says there is not a scholar in the world that is an ancient Near Eastern history or the history of that period of time, scholar of any stripe that believes what you just said. So quit saying it because it makes you sound stupid. That's kind of like my paraphrase of it. But it was so great because here you have a hostile witness, a guy that's not a Christian, who hates Christianity. He's written books to cut down the reliability of the text in some senses. Here is chastising another atheist who he's sympathetic with ideologically, but he disagrees with his scholarship, because if Bart Ehrman is a scholar of his field, and so there's some things he can't say because they'd just be false and everybody know it. So he holds to many of the things that are obvious. And so that's a great opportunity. And like I said, I have the citation in Street Smarts to point out to people that Bart Ehrman doesn't think Jesus is a myth.
Well, probably the Duke or Prince of all Jesus mythers is Robert M. Price. By the way, Robert Price has an MTS from Gordon Conwell, a PhD, 2 PhDs, one in systematic theology and one in New Testament, and yet he came out a Jesus myther, and I think he has debated Ehrman as well. The thing that I think eventually does Price's argument is this is what I've heard. He actually argued this. Somebody said to him, look, there's more textual and historical evidence for Jesus just on the basis of the number of texts than there is for Julius Caesar.
Right.
So if we have to dispense with the historicity of Jesus, then we should also dispense with the historicity of Julius Caesar. And my understanding is that Price says, I'm okay with that.
Okay.
So in other words, he's not interested. In terms of the canons of historical research, he's willing to throw all of those out the window.
Yeah.
As long as we don't have a historical Jesus.
Think about Will and Ariel Durant. They wrote the best-selling book of history on history, all right? And that's his multi-volume set of the history of Western civilization, or whatever it happens to be. He's a Nobel Prize winner or a Pulitzer Prize winner. Okay, so and he's got a whole volume titled Caesar and the Christ, about Caesar and Jesus. Where is he getting his information from? He's getting his good historical information from the primary source historical documents called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if this fellow you just mentioned, I didn't recall his name, but this Jesus myther, this main guy, if he wants to say, okay, that's good enough for me, I can just reject all of that stuff, well, he's welcome to that. But that doesn't mean it's wise, it's sound, it's sensible. It's not. It's foolish. It's foolish. And that just shows how deeply committed he is to a view that is not justified by the evidence.
He in other words, these people who deny the historicity of Jesus, they're either displaying ignorance or disregard for the common understanding of what is history and what it's supposed to do. And so, you can't take them seriously, and yet in some circles they're taken very seriously. But I admit those circles are pretty small.
Yeah,
I can only think of 2 or 3 Jesus mythers who have any academic credentials whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, what it shows is the academic credentials like 2 PhDs doesn't make you right.
Right.
And I have a tactic in the tactics book. It's a maneuver for a situation like that, and I call it Rhodes Scholar. And the idea behind the Rhodes Scholar tactic is just because a really smart, educated person says it, 1 PhD, 2 PhDs, 3 PhDs, doesn't matter how many letters they have to have after their name. It doesn't mean it's true. Right. What you have to look at are the reasons why they say it's true. And then you're in a position to assess the reasons. This is why you have an expert witness in a trial, and after the expert witness gives his testimony, guess what happens next?
the other side.
Cross-examination,
Right.
right?
Well, also the other side often has its own expert witness.
That's right. So, but this is what you want to do with so-called expert witnesses. You want to cross-examine them, at least in your own mind. What are the reasons that they gave, and do the reasons hold up under scrutiny, especially under the scrutiny of other people in their field that know how their particular field works? And that's the alternate expert testimony that you're talking about, Ron.
Simply citing someone's credentials that's called the appeal to authority fallacy. Saying, well, this person with a PhD said it, therefore it must be true. No, this person with a PhD said it, therefore perhaps gives us more reason to discuss what they're saying, perhaps. But even then, I found out many times people with PhDs can say outrageous things. So.
Well, we were talking about J. Warner Wallace a little bit ago, and so I said, well, J. Warner Wallace used his detective skills to determine that the New Testament was a reliable eyewitness testimony and Jesus rose from the dead. Well, if that's all I said, that was the end of it. Well, that would be an appeal to him as an authority doing that kind of work. Now, it doesn't mean that he's wrong, but there's more to it. He wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. And what he does then is step through all the particulars of how he came to the conclusions he came to. So in a sense, with the Rhodes Scholar tactic in mind, he's giving us the reasons why the conclusions he came to were good ones. And so this is what we need to do too with these so-called experts. Now, the time that you can usually rely on somebody's testimony like that is if they come up with a testimony and a conclusion that is against their personal interests. That's Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman doesn't like Christianity, okay? And he's written a note misquoting Jesus, for example, famously. That was his first book. And other things, trying to debunk Christianity and using scripture to do it. But when a guy like that comes out and says, well, the documents are filled with historical information about Jesus that you can rely on. Well, now you got a guy kind of speaking against his best interests, and that
got a hostile witness.
Well, there's a name for that.
Right.
There's a name for that. It's called the criterion of embarrassment.
Yeah.
And the criterion of embarrassment says that it's a type of historical analysis in which a historical account is deemed likely to be true if it has details that, the author would have preferred not to tell you.
Unflattering.
Right. And so that actually can be applied to scripture, because when you look at all of the so-called heroes until you get to Jesus, every single one of them has feet of clay. Right. Every single one of them has, you would think that all of these amazing heroes of the faith would just be perfect, impeccable people, and they're not. Over and over, we are presented with people who, if anything can be good said about them, it's only because of the good that God has worked in their lives. So that, of course, provides an additional criterion for judging the historicity of everything in the Old Testament leading up to Christ. And then we have 4 Gospels, not 1, not 2, not even 3. We have 4 Gospels. And one of them, the author goes out of his way to tell us how much research he put into it right at the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's embarrassing things are the embarrassing elements, the principle of embarrassment. This applies, of course, to the Gospels as well, because people will say, well, they just made this stuff up. Okay, here's my question. Once again, tactical style, street smarts style. Remember the title for the new book, Street Smarts, is using questions to answer Christianity's toughest challenges. So we're going to make a point against their point by using questions. We're not just gathering information of different sorts, what their view is or why they believe it. And that's what you brought up, Don, and the question that you offered to cultists. Why are you a Jehovah's Witness or LDS or whatever happens to be? But now we're going to take it a little bit further, and we're going to ask a question that is meant to demonstrate that their view is somehow challenged. So if they're going to say, yeah, well, those disciples, Peter and John, they just made all this up for, well, I'm not sure what reason they would do that. And that's another issue. Why would they make all this stuff up and then pay the price that many of them had to pay pay for the lie they knew was a lie. However, just looking at the context, the internal evidence, if Peter and John and these guys are making this stuff up, why would they write an account where Jesus says that Peter is inspired by the devil?
Right. And
Get behind me, Satan.
one thing that's probably kind of hard for us to think about or to understand as modern people, or even medieval people probably had a hard time understanding this, is how big of a criterion of embarrassment the crucifixion was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we see a lot of hints of that in the New Testament. It's foolishness to the Greek, a stumbling block to the Jews,
That's
the cross of Christ. It was a huge criterion of embarrassment. Who makes up, or who would write about a crucified Messiah?
Right.
Especially if it wasn't true.
Yeah. Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. That's Old Testament.
Who's going to buy that? Who's going to, well, thanks to the Holy Spirit, millions have bought into it. But in the first and second centuries, it was especially miraculous.
Yeah. Amazing. Right.
I'd like to, because we're kind of near the end of our time here, I'd like to do something to kind of reaffirm stuff you've already said and I've said. And it has to do with a friend who has passed away and the Jesus Seminar. You're familiar with the Jesus Seminar?
Oh, yeah. Yes, of course.
These days, but, scholars, it was started by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan and a number of others. And a friend of mine, an apologist, very sharp guy, great at asking questions, went to buy a book by Marcus Borg at a bookstore where Marcus Borg was signing. And so he patiently waited in line to get up with him and have him sign his book. And he posed this question because they've, all of the Jesus seminars voted. They've had their different colored marbles, red, pink, gray, and black.
Sure.
And infinite wisdom. They decided only 25% of the words in the New Testament were spoken by Jesus. So Bob asked him this question. He said,
"Oh, is this Bob Passantino?"
It was.
Yeah.
Okay. Bob Passantino.
I knew Bob.
Great guy. We had more fun together.
Yeah.
But he's with Marcus Borg, and he said, "Now, I understand, you don't believe the Bible is true, but if a person lived that was the Messiah, that was crucified, that did die, and then was raised again from the dead, since this is a made-up story, what would that story look like if it was really true?" And Marcus Borg, he stopped for a moment. He stared out the window, and he thought about it, and then he said, "I think it would look a lot like the Bible."
That's true. That's right.
Which shocked everybody in line.
Right. Well, Bob was he was an elegant guy. In fact, I have a thing on the deity of Christ. I call it Deity of Christ Case Closed. And it's in Street Smarts, and it's a little diagram that you can use out of John chapter 1, verse 3 to show that Jesus, or the one called the Word who became flesh in Jesus, was the uncreated creator. And if the uncreated creator is God, so then the Word is God who became flesh in Jesus. And I got that illustration from Bob Passantino many, many years ago. It was many years ago because Bob's been gone for about 15 years or so.
Yeah, right.
Excuse me. But he told me that story too. And I remember that. And it just goes to show how some people are just completely committed to a point of view in the teeth of the evidence. It no matter what evidence one presents, they are still going to hang on to that point of view. And there's not much you can do with people like that. Right. And if somebody's going to say, well, I'm okay with, you can't trust anything from ancient history, even information about Caesar, my response, and I've said this to people before, I said, okay, you're welcome to that. That's it. You're welcome to that. But don't think that that's the odds-on favorite, that you've got the smart answer, that you've took the evidence and looked it square in the face and came up with a conclusion that was consistent with it. You can believe whatever you want.
Right. And we can go out to dinner. We don't even have to talk about this. You can continue the relationship if it's possible.
Yeah.
Because it really is, as you point out, it's our task is to plant the seed, to do the planting and all of that. It's really up to the Holy Spirit.
That's right.
After that,
I purloined the Chalcedonian formula to illustrate this, which is a Christological formula: 100% God, 100% man. Right. So that's Jesus. But I think that that phrase actually helps explain the process that we're going through here and talking about. 100% God, 100% man. And what I mean by that is we are 100% responsible for our portion of the equation, and God is 100% responsible for his. Okay, what's my job? My job is to communicate the truth faithfully, graciously, and as persuasively as possible. All right? And that's it. The rest is up to God. Whatever effect comes out of my effort is God's responsibility. And this brings us back, Don, to something that you said right at the beginning of the show, the program, and that was there are no silver bullets. There's nothing magic here in Street Smarts. There's a great game plan that people can follow. There are answers to tough challenges, and there are conversations in there you can follow with the questions you can use to ask other people that will show them, hopefully, or that will display the liabilities of their view. It's all right there. It'll help you be more confident, more courageous, and I think make a much bigger difference in your gardening when you have a tool like this, a digging tool, if you will, gardening tool, so you can do some spade work. However, there's nothing magic. The answers are good, the techniques are good, but without the work of the Holy Spirit, nothing's going to happen. Right. And there were lots of people that Jesus talked to that never followed him. Look he even lost a disciple, for goodness sake. All right? Exactly. Because the critical element, the work of the Holy Spirit that makes the difference is what makes the difference. All right. Yes. And that's why we can boldly go forward and graciously with a game plan that I've outlined here that will help people to do that. But we could also rest and relax that God will take it from there. And boy, we don't have enough time for this, but I got all kinds of stories. I'm sure you do as well, where a little gardening was done here or there. And we think, oh, that didn't do any good. That went nowhere. That was a big flop. And then somewhere down the line, we learn that what Lee Strobel calls ricochet evangelism. It was one person hit somebody else to great effect. And that's the way the Holy Spirit works. Our job is to be there, to be ready, to be equipped, and to be faithful. And God will take it from there. 100% man and 100% God.
All right, I'm going to ask you to hang on for a minute right after we walk out of here, but it is time to do exactly that. Ron, would you walk us out of here?
Yes, let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil Before Me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygamous. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Herc, special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Joe Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping, and original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happen.
You know, I think that I need to mention that we have somebody's going to fill the Jesus Seminar news desk next week. It's going to be John Dominic Croissant. So,
and with that,
I forgot to tell you.
On that note, thank you.